Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. Nice to be seen. Well, we're back to the situation where nobody's in the room again. There was a period of several months, I can't remember how long, where we did have people in the room. And now we're back. So I guess we'll continue this way until all clear is clear again. Here comes a bottle of water. Thanks very much.
You're welcome, Rabbi.
Is
Have a
the
great service.
volume working?
To my knowledge, nobody's complained. Jen was usually said something.
Great.
And you haven't got no messages, have you?
I don't believe I have.
So we should be good. I'm gonna have Jen check it just to make sure while you're talking.
Good.
And then I'll give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
Okay, great, thank you.
No problem, sir.
So happy New Year to everybody. I hope that you're well and staying safe, and enjoying the beautiful day, although it's very, very cold outside. A couple of things. First of all, lest I forget, at the end, next week there will be no Torah study. I'll be on my semi-annual sojourn with one of my brothers. That is, if we're going to be able to do it. But in any event, no Torah study next week, and we'll reconvene again on the 22nd, I guess. Also, on a sad note, we lost a couple of days ago another person who attended Torah study regularly over the years, and that's Flo Talisman, a wonderful person whom I knew well. And as is our custom, when we lose a participant in Torah study, we always both acknowledge it and then pause for a moment just to remember Flo. Okay, thank you. So also has been our custom over these COVID months, now approaching its third year, about halfway through the session, I pause and take a look at my phone to see if anybody has a question or a comment to make. I fell out of that habit, as I'm sure you have recognized when people were in the room. That was an omission by me because so many of you were not here. But now I'm going to try to get back to that. So about halfway through, I will pause. If you have a comment or a question about anything that's going on here this morning, write to me. My email address is rklein, RKLEIN, @ttti.org. 3 T's and an I.org. Okay. Let's continue now with the blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshana b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through his commandments, and joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. All right, well, as a quick review of what we're doing this year, we're looking at Immanuel Kant's 4 basic questions. 3 of them occur at the end of his Critique of Pure Reason, a book that's 500 or so pages in length, so this comes after a long, long stretch of difficult philosophy. And then the 4th one takes place or occurs in his logic. The 4 questions are, and the first 3 are in the critique, and the 4th in the logic. What can I know? What ought I to do? For what may I hope? And what does it mean to be human? We spent several months at the beginning of this year looking at that 4th question, what does it mean to be human? And we saw essentially that there are two models of the human being in the Bible. The first one expressed in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, and the second one emerges with the call to Abraham. That does not mean that that first model is put aside once we arrive at Abraham. It continues and persists throughout the entire Tanakh and beyond that. In a certain sense, the call of Abraham is a response by God to what God has discovered in the first 11 chapters. And what he has discovered is a certain model of what it means to be human. Abraham is called as a kind of antidote, and that exploration continues on through the rest of the Tanakh, while it is hovered over, I might say, by Model 1. Model 1 reflects the waywardness, the problematic nature of the human being, who in many ways resists trying to organize his or her life according to the dictates, the commandments of God. God has given the human being free will, and that free will suggests that we can either go in the right path or go in the wrong path. And in the first 11 chapters, human beings go in the wrong path, operating under their own understanding of things, fundamentally animated by desire, and that desire gets them into a lot of trouble. God, at the time of Noah, decides to destroy his experiment, so to speak, and to start all over again. But that second post-Diluvian, after the flood, series of episodes, human beings go astray once again. And perhaps the climactic moment is when the people who are building the Tower of Babel say, let us build this tower to reach to the heavens so that we can make ourselves a name. Human beings, according to the Bible, when they try on their own to make their own name, to create their own lives, inevitably runs aground. Abraham is called, and the first thing God says to Abraham is, I will make you a great name. And so what we have with the call of Abraham is the beginning of a covenantal relationship between God and Abraham. Abraham does not lose his free will. He still has the capacity to obey or disobey. But now, in some significant way, Abraham is going to be guided by God. Not that Abraham is an automaton, maybe that's the wrong word, a puppet. Abraham still, as I just said, retains his capacity for acting on free will, but at least now Abraham is going to be guided, first in a kind of episodic way, and then at Mount Sinai in a more systematic way. Wayward humanity continues, but with Abraham and beyond, we begin to have some structures that allow us to live well and to create societies that are durable and that can sanctify life. And so, what does it mean to be human? We explored in those two models at the beginning of the year. We next turn to the question of ethics. What ought I to do? And we have been exploring several pathways into the biblical understanding of ethics. We focus to some significant degree on the Ten Commandments for a variety of reasons. They are a clear list of ethical admonitions that lead to law. And we explored not only some of the particular commandments, but the structure of the commandments as well. And along the way, we looked at a couple of rabbinic elaborations on especially honor thy father and mother. We looked the last time at Maimonides' great synthesis, so to speak, of the tradition's views of this, where Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah asserts that sons and daughters have strong, even absolute obligations to honor and to revere their parents. And Maimonides, again in the name of the tradition, elaborates on the meaning of both honor and revere. Even to the extreme extent do children have this obligation. Even when their parents are deceased, children have this obligation. But the parent can forego, to some degree, the honor due to him or her. So Maimonides creates a very interesting kind of dialectic. Yes, the child has absolute obligations, but no, the parent can resist the absolute obligation of children. And Maimonides concludes this by saying, and then Rashi does the same thing, that both parents and children have an obligation to obey the word of God, to follow the commandments. And therefore, should the parent ask the child to do something that violates a commandment, even though we have learned that the child has an absolute obligation to obey the parents, now we find yet another restriction, that if the parent asks the child to do something that violates a commandment, because both are obligated to God. Notice, by the way, that without that last claim, the supremacy, so to speak, of Torah, we might have a model of the home where the parent is the absolute ruler. That is, the parent has an absolute access to power. But now that we have surrounded, so to speak, the parent-child relationship with ethics, with obligations, the parent's power is now limited, and the parental role is transformed from being an absolute power within the walls of his or her home to being a teacher, the one who ought to and has the obligation to bring the children under the umbrella of ethics, halakha, law. So what we have done so far is to take a look at the Ten Commandments and then to see something very, very important, that though these Ten Commandments, and in particular the regulation to honor mother and father, are to some degree clear, how exactly to enact, to make this imperative important in our everyday life, we need interpretation. So that though we have in the Torah laws and ethical admonitions that point us in directions, the Torah legislation itself is not complete enough for us to live an active life in our daily activities without a way of interpreting and applying them. And this suggests that the written Torah, the Bible, requires an oral Torah. That is not that which is not a part of the Bible, but the components of an ongoing tradition. The written Torah requires the oral Torah. As the rabbis often say when they're looking at a passage of Torah, that this passage says, interpret me, darsheni, as if to personify the verse of Torah, which itself, in the voice of a human being, calls out to the reader, you have to interpret this, or you have to gain access to traditional interpretations, the wisdom of the ages, in order to know how to operationalize these things. One of the last things we looked at was the question of where does biblical legislation begin? Biblical legislation begins in some systematic way with the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20. And of course, that is not inevitable. If the Bible were a compendium of rules only, we might think that the Ten Commandments would come much, much earlier in the Bible. It only takes place in the 70th chapter of the Bible, 50 chapters of Genesis, and then in the 20th chapter of Exodus. Why? One way of understanding it is that the Torah's view is that law emerges from the narrative. In order to give proper authority to law and to the lawgiver, we have to see how it emerges in and through the story. And of course, one important component of this is what precedes the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments per se. And that is that God redeemed the Israelites from Egypt. And that is, God has given us the gift of freedom, and therefore we are beholden to God, who has made this kind of life possible to us. In other words, the question is, what gives God the authority to command? And from the authority to command by the commander comes the authority of the commandments themselves. And so the suggestion is, or at least the inference, is that the laws, however inherently profound they are, would not have the persuasive, the imperative force that the Torah wants them to have unless it emerges from the narrative. And then I made the claim that though narrative leads to law and ethics, those laws lead to more narrative. And as we understand it, the Israelites move from Sinai, they go into the Promised Land, they settle it, they conquer it, and then they live their lives. And they live their lives in both fidelity and infidelity. And the way in which they refuse to obey the laws, they move according to their own subjectivity, that leads to consequences. The consequences are climaxed by the Babylonian exile. So that how people respond to law generates the narrative that follows from the giving of the law. So narrative leads to law, and law leads to more narrative. So if this is the case, we might say that we have two sources of law. The definitive particular laws themselves, do not steal, do not covet your neighbor's wife or house or possessions, the laws of Shabbat and so on, so that one source of law is stipulations, laws presented as particular bits of imperative. But since narrative leads to law and law leads to narrative, we might also wonder whether or not we are going to find ethical admonitions, the ethics of the Bible. What ought I to do, not only in particular stipulations, posited law, but also in the narratives themselves. And so what I want to do today is to look at a particular narrative through the lens of John Barton, whose book, Understanding Old Testament Ethics, I have referred to before, and to allow Barton to guide us in understanding how a narrative itself expresses certain ethical rules, some of which would resist stipulation. In other words, the narrative gives us a sense of the nuances of life. I might say of the way to live a life that is beyond the capacity of a society to command them. We might call these norms. We might call this a framework, a worldview, which has content which may not be given easily to stipulation. So, two sources of ethics in the Bible: stipulation and narrative. And with that introduction in mind, I want to look now at the story of David and Bathsheba. I choose this story because that's Barton's model. We'll look at it, and then we'll see what Barton has to say about it. So I'm looking now at 1 Samuel chapter 11. No. 2 Samuel chapter 11. While you're finding it, I'll see if I can't control a little bit of this phlegm. Every time I wake up in the morning and think that, maybe I've got a cold, and whenever you worry about that in this environment, you worry that maybe you're going to maybe you have COVID. Fortunately, I have a few rapid test kits at home, and just tested myself again this morning, and fortunately I tested negative, so it's just a cold. Okay, so chapter 11 is the episode. Chapter 12 reflects the prophet Nathan coming in and reading David the Riot Act. So here's the setup. At the turn of the year, the season when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him, and they devastated Ammon and besieged Rabbah. David remained in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, David rose from his couch and strolled on the roof of the royal palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and the king sent someone to make inquiries about the woman. He reported, "She is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite." David sent messengers to fetch her. She came to him, and he lay with her. She had just purified herself after her period, and she went back home. The woman conceived, and she sent word to David, "I am pregnant." Thereupon David sent a message to Joab, his general in the field, "Send Uriah the Hittite to me." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab and the troops were faring and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and bathe your feet." When Uriah left the royal palace, a present from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the royal palace along with other officers of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When David was told that Uriah had not gone down to his house, he said to Uriah, "You just came from a journey. Why didn't you go down to your house?" Uriah answered David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are located at Sukkot, and my master Joab and your majesty's men are camped in the open. How can I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live by your very life, I will not do this." David said to Uriah, "Stay here today also, and tomorrow I will send you off." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. The next day David summoned him, and he ate and drank with him until he got him drunk. But in the evening Uriah went out to sleep in the same place. with his Lord's officers. He did not go down to his home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, which he sent with Uriah. He wrote in the letter as follows: place Uriah in the front line, where the fighting is the fiercest, then fall back so that he may be killed. So when Joab was besieging the city, he stationed Uriah at the point where he knew that there were able warriors. The men of the city sallied out and attacked Joab, and some of David's officers among troops fell. Uriah the Hittite was among those who died. Joab sent a full report of the battle to David. He instructed the messenger as follows: when you finish reporting to the king all about the battle, the king may get angry and say to you, why did you come so close to the city to attack it? Didn't you know that they would shoot from the wall? Who struck down Abimelech, the son of Yerubeshet? Was it not a woman who dropped an upper millstone on him from the wall of Tebez, from which he died? Why did you come so close to the wall? Then Joab said to the messenger, say to David, your servant Uriah the Hittite was among those killed. The messenger sent out. He came and told David all that Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, first the men prevailed against us and sallied out against us into the open. Then we drove them back up to the entrance to the gate. But the archers shot at your men from the wall, and some of your majesty's men fell. Your servant Uriah the Hittite also fell. Whereupon David said to the messenger, give Joab this message. Do not be distressed about the matter. The sword always takes its toll. Press your attack down the city and destroy it. Encourage him. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband Uriah was dead, she lamented over her husband. After the period of mourning was over, David sent and had her brought into his palace. She became his wife, and she bore him a son. Thus ends chapter 11. And at this point, for David, all is well. He has covered his tracks. Joab has not been reprimanded for losing the battle, because Joab did just what David asked him to do. And nobody has any grounds for believing that David had conspired this entire plot. Nobody else knows, and David is off the hook. Except in the biblical framework, there is God and God's mandate. And not only is there God and God's mandate and values, there is also God's messengers. And those messengers are the prophets. And the prophets often act as seers, that is, those who predict the future. But the prophet is never predicting the future in a crystal ball sort of way. The prophet's logic is always, I can see what the future will bring if you act in a certain way. In other words, the logic of prophecy is always what the independent variable is human action. The dependent variable is how things will turn out as a result of those actions. So the prophet's look into the future is never for its own sake. It is always as a consequence of the prophet's fundamental concern, and that is human behavior and the laws and rules and norms by which a human being ought to act. The prophet is essentially a representative of ethical norms, and only derivatively, but not unimportantly, also a seer into the future, as if to say to people, this is the right way to act and this is the wrong way to act. And each option is right and wrong. And I want you to act in that way. This is, in a certain way, this formulation is what we call in ethical theory deontology. That the value of an act is the act itself, irrespective of consequences. Immanuel Kant is the great representative of deontology. Act according to, in Kant's formulation, the categorical imperative. Categorical in the sense that if it's wrong to lie, it is categorically always wrong to lie. And the circumstances that surround it, that precede it, that follow it, are irrelevant. The categorical imperative gives us the locus of why I should act in a certain way. The act itself. Your motivation should be to do the right thing, period. So if the prophets were to say, act in this way because it is right or because it is wrong, is a sort of a pre-Kantian formulation of the categorical imperative. And biblical law is like this. When the Bible tells us not to take the Lord's name in vain, it doesn't say, and here's what we'll follow, or here are the circumstances in which. It just tells us this is what you should do. On the other hand, the Bible also has what we might call a utilitarian understanding of ethics. If Kant's theory is deontology, the act itself, utilitarianism is a kind of teleology, interested in consequences. If you want to create a good society, act in a certain way. Honor your father and mother, so your days on the land may be long into the future. That's utilitarian ethics. Why should I honor my mother and father? Because it creates a certain set of consequences, felicitous ones. So the Bible has both deontological, and teleological, utilitarian modes of ethics. The prophets, I think, represent both forms. Do this because this is the right thing to do. But in doing the right thing or the wrong thing, you create a certain kind of future. And the prophets are interested in the consequences of actions as well as in the action itself. Pure utilitarianism does not find the value in the action itself, but in the kind of consequences that come from it. John Stuart Mill is, I think, the best representative, at least in the 19th century, of a utilitarian ethics. We should do what we do in order to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. That's how I evaluate whether I should perform a certain action. Can I predict that it'll do the most good, the greatest good for the most number of people? So the prophet has an interest in consequences as well as the action itself. Okay, that was a little digression about prophecy, because here in this story about David and Uriah and Joab, David gets away with his crimes if all we have in our universe are human beings, because David has the power to conceal his actions from anybody and get away with it. In a system in which there is a transcendent source of behavior, God, a transcendent set of values that do not come and go, with the vicissitudes of history, but are always to be applied, and a representative of those transcendent values to people, namely the prophet, a mediator of those values to people. In this system, it is less likely, I wouldn't want to say unlikely, but less likely that people will get away with their behavior. And that is just what happens here. I'm going to read the last verse again, or 2 verses of chapter 11, then I'm going to move right into chapter 12. When Uriah's wife had heard that her husband Uriah was dead, she lamented over her husband. After the period of mourning was over, David sent and had her brought into his palace. She became his wife, and she bore him a son. The end. But no. But the Lord, chapter 12, was displeased with what David had done. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. Nathan, came to him and said, there were 2 men in the same city, one rich and one poor. Many of you know this analogy, this parable. There were 2 men in the same city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had very large flocks and herds, but the poor man had only one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He tended it, and it grew up together with him and his children. He used to share his morsel of bread, drink from his cup, nestle in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. One day a traveler came to the rich man, but he was loath to take anything from his own flock or herds to prepare a meal for the guest who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. David flew into a rage against that man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He shall pay for the lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and showed no pity. Okay. So, Nathan comes and rebukes David indirectly by telling him a parable which enrages David. And now let me read what Barton says about this. Here's a little bit of an introduction to what he's doing. At any rate, he says, it seems to me that there are many shared approaches to moral issues in this biblical material, which differentiate it from the more obviously moralistic attitude of the Deuteronomistic and later the chronistic works, and that consequently it makes sense to handle it all together. Chronistic means the books of Chronicles, the chronicler. Deuteronomistic, and those of us who worked together last year on Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic histories know that he is talking about a certain attitude, a moralizing attitude, a list of do's and don'ts, a kind of law code at the center of Deuteronomy from chapters 12 through 26 or so of Deuteronomy, moralistic. So let me read this again and maybe make a comment or two along the way. At any rate, it seems to me that there are many shared approaches to moral issues, not only stipulated law, lists of laws, law codes, but different approaches as well. He's pointing to narrative as a way of delivering moral admonitions, moral understanding. At any rate, it seems to me that there are many shared approaches to moral issues in this material which differentiate it from the more obviously moralistic attitude of Deuteronomistic and later still chronistic works, chronicles, and that consequently it makes sense to handle it all together in a book on Old Testament ethics, Hebrew Scriptures ethics. It makes sense, Barton is saying, to deal not only with what is obvious, the particular stipulations, but to do something that is not often thought to be done, and that is to look at the stories and to infer from the narratives a certain kind of moral principles. For our purposes, however, I'm going to concentrate on just two portions of this corpus: the stories of David, the stories of Joseph. There are, I suggest, two ways in which these stories inform us about the moral vision of their writers. First, they deal with moral issues that are not the subject of legal or wisdom texts. Deuteronomy, legal; Proverbs, wisdom. About which there is not, or perhaps cannot be, actual legislation, and they're too complex for aphoristic, small, short, pithy utterances, literature, which is the characteristic form of wisdom to handle. What he's saying here is stories may give us particular elements of ethics that, though some of them may repeat what the stipulated imperatives say, but in some way may get to a part of the moral universe that stipulated law can't get to. That is, the narratives may give us access to another element, another part of the moral universe, which law codes and their stipulations cannot get to. Let me read that sentence again. There are, I suggest, two ways in which these stories inform us about the moral vision of their writers. First, they deal with moral issues that are not the subject of legal or wisdom texts, about which there is not, or perhaps cannot be, actual legislation, and that are too complex for the aphorisms featured by wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs, and so on. And second, moral insights are conveyed by the way the stories are plotted, the plots, by the shape of the narrative, and by the interplay of characters in the story they tell. In other words, narratives can deliver this kind of unique window onto parts of the moral universe through literary devices, literary form. I'm going to read that again. And second, moral insights are conveyed by the way that the stories are plotted, the plots, by the shape of the narrative, and by the interplay of characters in the story they tell. In other words, it's the skill of the author that is able to find the proper way in which to convey what it is the author wants to get across to the reader. And then I'm going to continue. This is kind of an aside, but for me an interesting one. As I've indicated elsewhere, I've been interested in Martha Nussbaum's work. Martha Nussbaum teaches at the University of Chicago in 3 or 4 different departments, in the philosophy department, in the Committee on Social Thought. She also teaches in the law school. And he's referring to her book, I believe, The Fragility of Goodness, and so on. Let's see if I can come up with it. Maybe not. Anyhow, as I've indicated elsewhere, I've been interested in Martha Nussbaum's work on the way narrative texts and drama can be vehicles for the elucidation of moral issues in ways that are not possible through other more discursive genres, more direct. And I believe that the Old Testament is particularly rich in such examples. So what Barton is doing here is something akin to what Robert Alter has done, and that is to explore the riches of the narrative. And we've looked at Alter's writings over the years together. One of the things that Barton is doing, though, in particular, is he is also exploring a literary study of the Bible, but with a particular focus on the moral universe it conveys. First, then, the moral values that do not appear in Law and Wisdom. There are two speeches in the story of David that convey important moral attitudes. One is the speech of Nathan, when he confronts David with the murder of Uriah the Hittite after David's adultery with Bathsheba, in which Nathan presents the famous parable of the poor man and his single ewe lamb, which a rich neighbor steals in order to give dinner to an unexpected visitor. Discussion of legal principles in ancient Israel have sometimes tried to bring the parable in line with explicit laws, but the problem here is that the penalty proposed by David, involving both fourfold restitution and the death penalty, David says, he shall pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and showed no pity. I guess I have to go back. Discussions of legal principles in ancient Israel have sometimes tried to bring the parable into line with explicit laws. What are the rules in this narrative which we find elsewhere made explicit as stipulations? So there have been attempts to show the relationship between the elements of the story and particular laws. But the problem here with that, Barton is saying, is that the penalty proposed by David, involving both fourfold restitution and the death penalty, is quite unrelated to the laws about theft. If theft is the issue, then what David proposes seems to be a consequence not entertained by the Bible. Such discussions overlook the fact that what Nathan presents is an extreme case designed to evince not the king's judicial abilities, but the king's moral indignation and anger. Let me read that sentence again. Such discussions overlook the fact, that is, trying to find in the narrative where particular laws are indicated or moral norms that we can find in the lists elsewhere in the Bible. Such an attempt overlooked the fact that what Nathan presents is an extreme case designed to evince not the king's judicial abilities. Can David refer to a law in his anger? That's not what Nathan is after, but rather the king's moral indignation and anger. David is properly furious at the case presented to him because it involves not simply theft, but, and here comes Barton's first insight, the exploitation of the poor man by his rich neighbor. David is properly furious at the case presented to him because it involves not simply theft, but the exploitation of the poor man by his rich neighbor. The parable will work only if Nathan can take it for granted that the king, like any other right-thinking person, will be outraged by a man who has all that he needs and yet exploits the poor. In other words, Nathan is assuming that David has a conscience, a moral compass. If David were totally amoral, he would be told this story and would have no reaction to it. The very reaction shows that David does have a moral compass. Of course, he didn't exploit it in the previous chapter, but he has it. And Nathan's indirection traps David, so to speak, into an expression of his moral indignation. The depiction of the lamb as like a daughter to the poor man is not a mere literary flourish, but an essential part of the moral case being put. This is a lamb which is not merely the rightful possession of the poor man, but one which is dear to him. The parable presupposes that possession is not simply a matter of legal entitlement, but may also involve emotional attachment, and that this attachment has a moral value. Similarly, the rich man's offense is not simply theft. He deserves to die because he had no pity. Exploitation, emotional attachment, pity. These are parts of the lexicon of a moral universe, but it is very hard to enact a law or enunciate a principle that will get somebody to express pity. Pity is a feeling. Pity emerges from the inside. What we feel is also part of the moral universe. I'm going to read this again. The depiction of the lamb, as like a daughter to the poor man is not a mere literary flourish, but an essential part of the moral case being put. This is a lamb which is not merely the rightful possession of the poor man. Therefore, the issue here is not just theft. It was his possession. You took it. You're a thief. It's not merely the rightful possession of the poor man, but one which is dear to him. The parable presupposes that possession is not simply a matter of legal entitlement, but may involve emotional attachment, and that this emotional attachment has a moral value. Or to put it differently, your emotional attachment is my imperative. I am obligated to take into account not only that you possess a certain thing, but that it's dear to you. That adds a valence and intensity to my obligation, not to take what is yours. That it's more than theft. Similarly, the rich man's offense is not simply theft. He deserves to die because he had no pity. Only by this means, this story, can Nathan bring home to David that in his own adultery and murder, he's not merely broken a law, but has offended against humanity. Only by this means, in other words, this is the genius of Nathan. He's speaking for God. God is enraged. And Nathan is the vehicle through whom that rage is expressed. But the manner, the mode, how Nathan delivers it, is Nathan's creation. Only by this literary means, this parable as a means, can Nathan bring home to David that in his own adultery and murder, he has not merely broken a law, but has offended against humanity. Like Amnon, when he rapes his sister Tamar. This happens very quickly. This happens in the next chapter, in chapter 13. Like Amnon, when he rapes his sister Tamar, David has done something which, in quotes, is not done in Israel. Pastnish. We don't do this. We don't act this way. This is not part of our moral universe. Well, Dad, you tell me that we don't do it this way. Point out the law. Point out the rule. This is a matter of feel. This is a matter of recognizing the nuances of the moral life. Like Amnon, when he rapes his sister Tamar, David has done something which is, in quotes, not done in Israel, and committed an act of folly. The strongly charged term for moral misconduct, familiar from the wisdom literature. There is no problem here about possible ambiguity as to the narrator's approval or disapproval. The whole way the story is told implies that the narrator aligns himself with Nathan, the narrator of the story that Nathan tells. There's no problem here about possible ambiguity as to the narrator's approval or disapproval. I want to be sure we understand this. There are two narrators here. There's the narrator in the story, that's Nathan, and the narrator who brings the story, that's not Nathan, but the biblical author who is telling the story of Nathan telling the story. And what Barton is getting at here is the one who is telling the story of Nathan's telling the story, the outer narrator, is not neutral. That narrator is aligning himself with Nathan and telling the story from Nathan's perspective. There's no problem here about possible ambiguity as to the narrator's approval or disapproval. The whole way the story is told implies that the narrator aligns himself with Nathan, and indeed that God does so too. For it is God who sends Nathan to the king. Uriah has been treated as a non-person. When I treat somebody as merely a means to my own ends, as merely a vehicle, and I don't see their personhood, I am violating a part of the moral universe. But what law can I enact that tells me not to treat somebody as a non-person? What could that mean? How should I do it? All sorts of things need to be defined, and it would still be deeply ambiguous. This is something that can't be stipulated, but is still part of the right way to act. Uriah has been treated as a non-person who can be elbowed out of the way with impunity. But it takes the construction of a moral case about a wholly different set of events to bring this home to David. If Nathan were just to come in and directly rebuke David for what he did, David would get defensive, not hear the point, and the power of the imperative will not have rung true to David, and therefore all the more to us. It takes the construction of a moral case, a parable, about a wholly different set of events, the shepherds and so on, to bring this home to David. An analogy from a different sphere is more powerful than a frontal attack on his wrongdoing. In other words, it's not just the what of a moral universe, what are the rules and the laws, but the how. How are these things imparted? How do we come to understand them and appreciate them and bring them into our lives? So there's also the issue of how things are taught. And the best teachers from time to time don't just teach directly, they tell stories that engage the interest of the listeners and bring them in actively to what is going on in the story. Certainly Nathan's speech endorses two legal principles, the prohibitions of murder and adultery, which we find in the Decalogue, but it goes much beyond this, to tease out a vision, to tease, not directly stipulate, to tease out a vision of the way human beings should relate to one another in society. Nathan assumes that a well-ordered society will be one in which ties of affection are respected by others, even the rich, even rulers, even the king. No one is exempt from respecting ties of affection. That's another reason why this whole episode is so powerful. That it would be one thing if Nathan said to me, you gotta respect me. But he goes to the king. Even the leaders of a society are not exempt from the basic fundamental moral axioms and stipulations of that society. Nathan assumes that a well-ordered society will be one in which ties of affection are respected by others. Who are those others? Even the rich, even rulers, even the king. The poor and the subordinates of those in power are to be treated as human, not as pieces on a chessboard to be moved around at will. I think it's a brilliant explication and does point out that if we look for answers to the question, Kant's second question, how ought I to act? And we're going to try to discover what the Bible has to say about that. We can certainly look at the Ten Commandments. We can certainly look at Exodus chapters 21 through 23, all kinds of laws. We can certainly look at Leviticus. We can certainly look at the law code. It's not entirely a code. In Deuteronomy, we can find all kinds of imperatives there. But if we really want to get to the depth and the extent of the Bible's moral vision, then we have to go to the narratives. Because the narratives are not merely what one scholar calls serious entertainment. They also give us something that is precious and that takes dexterity and insight to glean, and that is a vision of how a society ought to act. And that requires an understanding of more than what can be stated in brief imperatives. Okay, so let me take a look at my phone and just see if you have anything you have here. Someone wrote about my Devar Torah last night. The narrative of Tamar provides a moral lesson without the intervention of a prophet to make the point. Yeah, that's a nice comment. The narrative of Tamar, that is the rape of Tamar by Amnon, chapter 13, the next chapter, provides a moral lesson without the intervention of a prophet to make the point. Judah knows, he's talking about, I see. There are two Tamars in the Bible. There is one of David's daughters, chapter 13 of 2 Samuel and beyond, and there's also Judah and Tamar back in chapter 38 of Genesis. This person is referring to that. You remember that Judah goes down into Canaan and marries a woman, has 3 sons. Those sons, each in turn, marries Tamar. The first one, he's sinned, he's killed. The second one, at performing levirate marriage, then cohabits with Tamar, and he dies. And then Judah, the father, doesn't bring the third son to Tamar because he's worried that Tamar will also be responsible for the death of his third son. And so something is now incumbent upon that family to provide an heir, H-E-I-R, to the deceased brothers so that their name is not forgotten in Israel, and also by extension, their property can be passed down in an orderly way. Judah has no intention, of the brothers of Jacob, of the sons of Jacob. So Judah is automatically kind of one of the prime characters in the book of Genesis. We might even call him a hero, who doesn't live up to his obligation to provide an heir for his deceased sons. But Tamar, a Canaanite, does find a way, and a suspect way. She dresses as a harlot and seduces Judah without his knowing it to bear a child. And when Judah finds out that she bears a child, he says, kill her, she's violated. But when he discovers what she's been up to, he says, she is more righteous than I. So this person is saying that there's a lesson here about obligation. This is a story about morality too. The narrative of Tamar provides a moral lesson without the intervention of a prophet to make the point. This is true. Judah knows, this person goes on to say, she is more righteous than I. This leads via Peretz to the line going to David. Exactly. So this circles back to my point about two different moral theories that in a certain way are represented in the Bible. A deontological perspective, this is the right thing to do. Tamar has done the right thing. And that is sufficient to account for the quality of that act. You do the right thing, this is enough. But there's also a utilitarian idea here too, that the right thing will often lead to consequences. And the consequences have something to do with the evaluation of that act. And here, Tamar has not just done the right thing, but her act leads to a consequence that is astonishing. She becomes the ancestor of King David. That is, without her act, there would have been no King David. I'm not sure what the point of this person's comment is. Seems to be the point is we can get this moral vision without the mediation of a prophet. And that's true. Is there something at stake in this? I mean, couldn't we simply say that the Bible finds different ways of mediating its vision through narrative? On the one hand, prophets deliver them, they do parables and so on. On the other hand, the narrator of the story doesn't require a narrator to tell a parable. The narrator can just tell the story on his own. And both are true. I'm not sure what the point of the difference is, but I'm sure this person will let me know. Very good. But in any event, even if there is no ultimate point, it's still a very good idea that this moral vision, moral universe beyond stipulation can be delivered by the Bible in a variety of ways. Okay, so the next topic, which I think we'll do in 2 weeks, remember no session next week, is to take up particular areas of biblical ethics. I want to look at the whole question of the sojourner and the stranger and what the Bible has to say about that. Here, we're in the domain of stipulation, but we'll note that that stipulation emerges from the narrative. The narrative is brought to give power to the stipulation, care for the stranger, and by implication, all the others who are the vulnerable members of a society, the widow and the stranger and the orphan and so on. So that this particular area of biblical ethics, how to deal with the stranger, the sojourner, is again a product, that's too strong, is again nested, a bird nest, nested in the story. It's the story that is being told before that lends power, dignity to this particular imperative. So the next time I want to deal with that particular kind of law, ethical norm, then I also want to look at who are, according to the Bible, the teachers of ethics. Who brings these things to the people, and wherein lies their power? So we still have several things to do in terms of biblical ethics. Notice what we're doing. We're kind of hitting certain kinds of issues in the Bible. I don't know that this is going to add up to some overall and coherent theory. I've tried a little bit the deontology, teleology, doing the right thing for its own sake, and doing the right thing which becomes more right or wrong in terms of the consequences. So I'm trying to get a little theory into this, but we're just exploring different aspects of this problem. So I hope you're going to stay well. I sure do hope that the prediction that this Omicron variant is going to burn itself out before or at the end of the month. We still have 3 weeks to go with that. And the cases, of course, are mounting very rapidly, even exponentially. But I'm hoping for the diminution of the power of this variant, and maybe we'll be able to get beyond this. One of the things that scientists and policymakers are thinking about is ways in which we're not going to be able to defeat the virus, but on the model of the seasonal flu, to be able to live with it, to find ways to keep it at bay, while recognizing perhaps that it's always going to be there. Anyway, I hope we're going to find our way out of this so that we can return to one another again and really enjoy the fruit of our community and interpersonal relationships. Okay, until the next time, Shabbat Shalom.